Hey guys, and welcome to another tutorial by artandcontext.org. My name is Matt, and this is where we explore various art-related topics. In today's tutorial, we will be covering the topic of how to draw abdominal muscles, more specifically how to draw abs as a holistic structure on the male torso. When it comes to drawing something unique like this or an anatomical structure such as this, there are a few things we want to consider. The first thing we want to consider is general shape and form, where we figure out the overall structure of the body, and this is where we want to understand scale, where we want to understand how the muscle groups surrounding the abdominal muscle groups also connect. And kind of create a more holistic structure. Obviously, when drawing abdominal muscles, we're not drawing them in isolation, but we are drawing them within the context of the entire torso. In this tutorial specifically, we will be drawing abdominal muscles in the male torso, giving us an opportunity to see how it fits in that structure. And then what we will kind of shift into is understanding the nature of the abdominal muscles and how they protrude and therefore create shadow formation along the body, and how that shadow formation ultimately defines these muscle groups on the surface of the skin, resulting in a realistic representation within our abdominal muscle drawing. Now, with that being said, let's get started. So the way in which we're going to start is with a light pencil sketch, and this is where we actually start to form and shape the structure in a little bit more of a generic sense. And what I mean by a generic sense is what we want to do is we want to kind of capture the overall scale of how the surrounding muscle groups, such as the pectoral muscles, such as the obliques and the abdominal muscles, how they kind of pair and are compared to one another in terms of scale and size. So a good way we can start is kind of with this more diagrammatical approach, where we set up a vertical line and a perpendicular horizontal line that defines the overall shape of the torso. So what we can start doing is we can actually start lightly sketching in the upper body, and this is where we can kind of include the general outline of the shoulders and how it kind of flows in this triangular formation and becomes slightly more narrow towards the side area near the ribs or the oblique muscles, and as we ultimately come down to the hips. Now, in order to draw these abdominal muscles, we want to make sure that we're capturing them in the correct framework of the entire male torso, and this is why we want to draw in the structure from the shoulders all the way to the pectoral muscles, and then ultimately to the oblique areas. So in the early stages of developing the sketch, what you want to do is you kind of want to just figure out the general outline of the entire male torso, and this is where you can slowly start to work in the curvature of the deltoids, or otherwise known as the shoulder muscles, and how they flow into the clavicle bone, which kind of flows into the pectoral muscles. So the clavicle bone is a really good kind of frame that kind of defines the upper torso and ultimately gives you a good framework or starting point in order to establish the pectoral muscles that will ultimately then flow into the bicep area and the obliques. And then slowly, as you start to come down to the navel area, we can start to see how those oblique muscles create that V-like shape that goes near towards the pubic bone or the pubic area, and that is slightly more narrow to that of, or compared to that of, the upper torso. So with a more defined male torso, where the muscles are slightly more defined and the muscle fibers are a little bit more dense, we will find that it creates this more triangular shape. So the upper torso from the deltoids to the pectoral muscles tend to be quite larger, and then the obliques area starts to become slightly more narrow as it forms or kind of narrows down into the abdominal area. Now, something important to understand about the abdominal area is that the abdominal muscles have different sizes. So the upper abdominal muscles, the rectus abdominis, and the muscles slightly above the rectus abdominis are a little bit more smaller in relation to that of the lower abdominal muscles near the navel area. So this is something we want to think about in terms of how this is going to be represented in the drawing. Now, Now, according to genetics, obviously different muscle groups tend to be larger and smaller, so it's really dependent on how you would like your abdominal muscles to be represented within a drawing, but it's always going to be the case that the upper abdominal muscles are slightly smaller than the lower abdominal muscles, and this is where we start to see that flattening near the navel area or below the navel area, because that lower abdominal group of muscles or set of muscles tends to be harder to define. So as we continue with our drawing, what we also want to consider is what's happening beneath the surface of the skin, and this is where we start to think about how the cartilaginous and bonal structure around these muscle groups start to create these moments of indentation, which ultimately gives more protrusion to the muscle groups, and this is why shadow formation has the unique effect on the male torso or the abdominal area as it does. Now, when we think about the pectoral muscles and the striations that develop from the center connecting area where the two pectoral muscles meet, they kind of develop outwardly towards the armpit area or towards the deltoid, and this is kind of partitioned by the sternum, which is this bone structure that connects all the way to the clavicle, or otherwise known as the collarbones, that define that bonal structure, that T-shaped bonal structure that gives shape and form to the upper torso near the shoulders. The same can be said for the abdominal area. So the reason why the abdominal area have these shadow formations is because the sternum kind of flows into this bone structure that like weaves through the abdominal area, and this is what segments the abs into these pecs or sets, and these sets run all the way from below the sternum all the way down to the navel area. This is also what kind of segments the abdominal features from the oblique areas, which kind of form along the side of the body. So it's really helpful for us to also consider looking at anatomical diagrams of the male torso to just get a better sense of what's happening below the surface of the skin. Now, when we think about what's happening on the surface of the skin, the epidermis or the skin is basically stretched over these features. So what is happening is that when these muscles are developed, they're causing a protrusion from beneath the surface of the skin, and therefore creating moments of protrusion and indentation along the surface area of the skin. And this is where we start to see the distinction between the bonal structure and the cartilaginous structures that run through and in between these muscle groups, and compared to that of the muscle groups that kind of protrude outwardly from the body, especially if these muscle groups are defined. So as we proceed with our pencil drawing, these are some things we want to take note of, and it's going to assist us in terms of an accurate placement of these features. So as we proceed with drawing in these muscle groups, we want to think about how the bonal structure in between these muscle groups are going to kind of create the muscles to protrude from the body, which therefore will obviously demonstrate that these bonal structures are creating an indentation between these muscles, which is going to cause a shadow formation. So this is also going to be quite indicative of where our shadows will be placed. So the other thing we want to think of as we proceed with our drawing is how a light source is going to interact with this male structure, and therefore create a unique shadow formation due to the protruding and indentation nature of these various anatomical features. So as we continue with our drawing process, we want to start thinking about how to define these protruding muscle groups by the incorporation of shadow formation that will ultimately be running along the grooves or the indentations caused by the bonal and cartilaginous structures running through and in between these muscle features. Now, at this point, we want to kind of start to think about a light source and how a light source would be interacting with the surface area of the skin on top of the male torso. So now we know that we have this combination of bone structure causing indentations or grooves within the male torso, and as well as these muscle groups which are causing protrusions that stick out and therefore are becoming more exposed to light source. So naturally, if these features, these muscle groups are causing protrusions and are more exposed, around them within the grooves caused by the bone structures, we are going to develop shadow formations. And this is because naturally, if something is blocking a light source, it's going to cast a shadow around it. Now, this is the nature of how light will interact with any three-dimensional object, and the anatomical structure of a male torso is no different. However, what we want to do is we want to be quite strategic about, or pay attention to the smaller details in terms of how these shadow formations form within the body. So for instance, when we consider the oblique muscles, we want to consider that they have these striations or strands and segments that run diagonally, and the way in which we represent this on the skin is through adding in some shadow formation and line work that flows diagonally. However, as it connects to the abdominal muscles, those shadow formations will become slightly more horizontal, so therefore we want to start integrating a more horizontal format of shadow formation, and then a more vertical format of shadow formation moving in the middle section or vertically through the entire set or pack of abdominal muscles all the way to the sternum. Now, the same for the sternum. The sternum obviously flows underneath the pectoral muscles, and the pectoral muscles themselves are going to cast shadows beneath the lower section of themselves, and naturally that is because as they protrude and stick out, they're going to cast a shadow beneath them. We'll also start to see that a shadow formation will form along the central area of the sternum that runs through and divides the pectoral muscles naturally, because as these pectoral muscles again protrude, they're going to cast a shadow formation on the grooves in between them. So this is what we want to start to think about. This is why it's really important for us to consider looking at a anatomical diagram of the male torso, considering what's happening beneath the surface of the skin, which features protrude, the difference between bone, cartilaginous, and muscle structures, and how that obviously creates these unique shadow formations within the body or on the surface of the epidermis or skin. Now, once we obviously understand the anatomical combination of these various features and how they're placed together, how they kind of are different in scale, and how this creates both protrusions and indentations on the surface of the skin, we want to take our time working with our pencils. And the reason being is we first want to develop a light sketch. We always want to start with light sketching before moving on to working with darker mediums, and that way you can kind of use the light sketch as a means of guiding you and assisting you to create more contrast and create a more vivid detailing within the drawing later on. We want to continue with this process until we have worked in shadow formation with our pencil throughout the various features. Another thing we want to consider as we continue with our drawing process using our pencils is that which features are going to cast shadows on other features. So they're going to be shadow formations developed by the striations and muscle developments in each muscle group. So there's going to be more subtle shadow formations there, but then other muscle groups such as the pectoral muscles are going to cast shadows on the serratus anterior, which are the smaller muscles closer to the upper rib cage area or close to the armpit area where the pectoral connects to the bicep. So it's important for us to remember that a torso or a figure is a three-dimensional structure with mobile body parts, which means that these features are kind of protruding a lot more than other surrounding features, and this is particularly true for the chest or pectoral area. So from the deltoids to the biceps to the chest, these features tend to be larger muscle groups and kind of protrude outwardly a lot more significantly than that of the actual abdominal area. So naturally what's going to happen is those features are going to create a little bit more of a darker shadow formation on the surrounding or lower features. Also, if there's a light source present, those areas tend to be slightly more exposed, and therefore they're going to be slightly lighter than that of the lower features such as the serratus anterior muscles, those small muscles, the obliques, and the abdominal muscles. And this is where we start to see why when abs are so defined or when they are so developed and have such a muscle density to them, they start to look really good. It's more because the shadow formation around them is a lot more distinct, and it's also due to a lighting component. So the upper features tend to be more exposed to light and therefore casts a shadow or the shadow formation becomes a little bit more starker on the abdominal area, and then emphasizes the grooves in between the abs, as well as the striations within the obliques, and so on and so on. And this is basically what defined abs are. Sure, the muscles are naturally more dense and therefore protrude slightly more, but it is more a concept of lighting and how light reacts to the surface of these protruding features and the grooves surrounding these protruding features or muscle groups. So thinking about the three-dimensional nature of these various muscle groups is also going to give you a better indication of how to form shadows within the muscle groups. And this is where we can start to really pay attention to the definition of these muscle groups. So it's really up to us in terms of how defined we want these muscles to be and how defined they are going to be represented in our drawing due to the concept of light interacting with the surface. So remember, it's really important for you to really consider a light source and think about light throughout the entire pencil shading or pencil sketching process as you work out these different features. So once we have the general shape, the idea is to then start refining the shape into a more realistic representation of these features with the consideration of a light source and the three-dimensional nature of these various features. We want to think about the grooves defined by the cartilaginous and bone structures throughout the male torso, such as the sternum, as well as the transverse intersections, as well as the linea alba, and so on and so on, and thinking about how these bone structures create the definition and grooves around these muscle groups. We also want to think about the unique striations within the muscle groups. For instance, something like the serratus anterior connecting to the obliques is going to be a unique muscle feature that will create shadow formations itself due to the segmentations of these muscle groups connecting to one another. So this is the general process of what you want to consider as you draw muscles. And this process is not just something that we apply to the male torso in terms of how do we develop a unique abdominal quality within the male torso or a female torso, but this is something we want to think about in general in terms of pursuing an anatomical structure and how to represent it as accurately as possible. We want to think about how these muscles are formed, what they're made of, and how they kind of segment due to the partition quality kind of created by these bonal structures and cartilaginous structures around them. Now continue with your pencil shading process until you feel that you have kind of attended to all the features, and not just the abdominal muscles but the obliques, the smaller muscles under the pectoral muscles such as the serratus anterior. You want to make sure that you've kind of worked in some shading to the other surrounding features such as the deltoids, defining the jugular notch, which is developed by the clavicle. Maybe you want to add some detail to the neck, and this is so we can also just contextualize the abs. The abs or the abdominal muscles aren't just some group of muscles that we can draw in isolation. We need to draw them in combination with the surrounding muscles in order for us to have a more accurate sense of how they exist and form within the body. Once we have completed that, we can start shifting into darkening these features. In this tutorial, a good suggestion would be to use something like a ballpoint pen. Ballpoint pen is a really good tool to use for shading because it works quite similar to that of a pencil. This is because the ink comes out quite sparingly, so we have this agency over our mark making process and also the ability to replicate certain shading processes similar to that of a pencil, such as smooth shading. And in this particular tutorial, that is what we want to do. We want to actually pay attention now to creating these gradient shifts within our shadow formation, and this is going to just emphasize and enhance the realistic nature of our abdominal drawing. Now we're going to start with shading in these various features, and this is where again we really want to consider what's happening with the light source and how it's interacting with the surface. So a good suggestion would actually be to start with the serratus anterior or the oblique area and connecting to the pectoral area. Now again, because the deltoids and the pectoral area are slightly larger, they're going to be slightly more protruding than that of the lower features, such as the serratus anterior and the abdominal muscles and the obliques and so on and so on. So naturally what this is going to do is it's not only going to cause a shadow formation under the pectoral muscle itself, but it's slightly going to darken the lower features compared to that of the surface area of the pectoral muscles. So this is something we want to consider, and what we want to do is we want to actually build up layers of shadow with our pen. When shading with pen, the intention is to not press too hard. Pen obviously is still a very volatile medium, so susceptible to mistakes. So what we want to do is we actually want to build up our layers, light layer after light layer, slowly building them up until we reach a tonal value that we are satisfied with. And this is where we're going to slowly take our time working in shadow formation through the process of shading with our pens and creating distinctions between the tonal range present in the male torso drawing. Now this is where we really want to pay attention to more final subtle shadow transitions in the body. So for instance, it's really important to think about the fact that skin is this layer over these structures, bone and muscle structures beneath the surface of the skin. So what that is doing, depending obviously on how developed and defined and how protruding the muscles are, it's going to create more seamless transitions between shadowing and shadow formations throughout the abdominal drawing. So as we kind of work in these shadows, what we want to think about again is what's happening with these various muscle groups and how they kind of flow and seamlessly integrate into one another in terms of shadow formation. So as we move from the oblique area and into the abdominal muscles, we want to consider that if the light source is present, the shadow formation is going to be a lot more darker at the lower section of each abdominal muscle, whereas there will be a more lighter shadow formation on the top of the abdominal muscle because it is more present to a light source. However, obviously naturally, as the abdominal muscles connect to one another, we can kind of create these darkened segmentations or shadow formations between them, and then slowly create a lighter gradient shift as we come to the surface area of each abdominal muscle. So in more simple words, the grooves developed by the bone structure between the abdominal muscles are going to create a more dark shadow formation, but as we come to the exposed muscle that protrudes, those shadows will become slightly lighter. Now remember, when using pen, we don't want to do this by just pressing hard on our pen and creating these dark marks. What we want to do is we really want to pay attention to the pressure we apply to our pen, similar to that of a pencil, and build up these marks with light layer on top of light layer. And this is where we build up the layers, slowly defining these features until we come to a dark tonal value that we are happy with. The same can be said for the pectoral areas. Naturally, as the pectoral areas protrude, the lower section of the pectoral muscle is going to be slightly darker, but then there's going to be a gradient shift in that shadow that becomes lighter as we come to the more exposed top section of the pectoral muscle that will naturally be exposed or more exposed to a light source. We really want to think about these protruding qualities and which are more protruding qualities to that of other surrounding features as we integrate some shadow formation by the utilization of shading. So naturally, for instance, when we work our way through the abdominal muscles, the lower abdominal muscles tend to be less defined, so we'll find that the shadow formation starts to become a little bit more faint or a little bit lighter, and this is just due to the fact that those muscles are not as defined as the upper abdominal area. Now, the area between the lower pecs and the upper abdominal muscles and the serratus anterior muscles will tend to be the most contrasted and highly shadowed areas, because that area is mostly covered, or at least shadows are cast on those areas predominantly due to the pectoral muscles and the surrounding features such as the biceps and the deltoids. So we really want to think about defining those muscles with shadow formation a little bit more distinctly to that of the more exposed areas such as the top pectoral area and the lower abdominal area. Shading, again guys, can't stress this enough, is simply a matter of considering light and how it interacts with three-dimensional objects, and that's going to make your life a lot easier. So again, because the pectorals are going to protrude more, there are going to be shadow formations just below the pectoral muscles that are slightly darker, and as the lower section of the abdominal area where the external obliques connect to that V section, that pubic area, and the navel area, they become more exposed to light, and then they start to become a little bit more lighter in terms of contrast and shadow formation. But otherwise guys, this is the general process of how to draw abs. From this point on, it's more a matter of simply taking your time and building up your shadow layers with your pen. If you're using a darker pencil, the same process applies. Don't press too hard or don't make dark marks straight away. This way it's hard to rectify. Rather, what you want to do is build up layers through the process of adding light layers on top of light layers until you have come to a tonal value that makes sense within the drawing. The other thing is just thinking about the light source and its connection and its interaction with the three-dimensional nature of the male torso, and that's where we start to think about the features that protrude more than the other features. In the early stage of developing your sketch, again, consider looking at diagrammatical drawings or anatomical drawings that define the male torso beyond the layer of the skin, and that's where we can start to see how the muscles are actually connected and segmented and divided by these bone structures and cartilaginous structures that move through them. This is going to give you a better sense of how to be a little bit more strategic with your scale, and then ultimately your shading, and then ultimately how to darken your shading to have a more effective shadow formation in your structure. But otherwise guys, that's it from me. I hope this tutorial was really informative and helpful. Once you get to the shading process, simply just take your time working shadow formations along the grooves that flow on the bone structures in between these protruding muscle groups as a way of indicating where the shadow placements will form around these muscle groups. And then beyond that, depending on how defined the muscles are, the striations and segmentations within each muscle group can become a little bit more defined depending on how defined you want to represent it in your drawing. And that's where we start to see how the oblique muscles will create shadow formations around them, such as the serratus anterior as well, due to the fact that they not only are covered or shadows are cast on them by the pectoral muscles or the surrounding muscles, but the fact that they have these segments in their muscle groups that will create shadow formations in the muscle group alone. But otherwise guys, these are the general ideas, concepts and principles to think about when drawing an abdominal or a male torso drawing. But not only for the male torso, when you are drawing any muscular structure and you want to do so in an accurate way and represent these structures, it's important for you to consider researching and looking into these diagrammatical representations of body parts and seeing how large these muscle groups are, which ones protrude more, and how they are paired together in order to have a more accurate representation in your own drawing. So with that being said, if you liked this video and you found it to be helpful, please like, please subscribe. That helps us a lot. We really want to start pursuing a lot more anatomical drawing topics or any topic related to the human body. I think it's really interesting. It also builds up a broader knowledge of how to approach figure drawing and other related drawing topics that involve human anatomy. So yeah, I hope this video was helpful, hope it was cool, and I hope there's something that you can gain from it. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Until then, cheers.